Welcome back. We're glad you joined us today. In our teaching session this week, Arlene explained to us the symbolism and practice of the Feast of Tabernacles. And remember, this was the festival that was held every year to commemorate the Jewish nation's 40 years of wandering in the desert. And it's important that we understand the significance of these desert wanderings because John intentionally ordered his gospel to point his readers to Jesus as the fulfillment of these wanderings. So Jesus was their bread from heaven. Jesus was the water from the rock, and Jesus was their light in the darkness. And today in our homework, we're actually only going to look at one verse, John 8:12, which says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." And Jesus' words aren't new here. John has already pointed to the connection between Jesus and light. In John 1:4, he says, "In him was life, and that life was the light of men." So we see in these verses the connection between Jesus and light, but it's actually pointing even further to the connection between light and life. So can you tell us a little bit more about this connection?
Well, to really understand it, we have to go all the way back to the very beginning. So Genesis 1:1-4 tells us, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness." So the first phrase that God spoke, the very first act of his creation, was bringing light out of the darkness.
Yeah, so God created light. He created the sun and the moon to separate day and night, to mark times, to mark seasons, and to give light upon the earth. But while there was light and there was day, night still came, and for a set period of time, darkness would prevail.
Yes, and in previous weeks we've talked at length about Israel's deliverance from slavery at the hand of God. And these years in Egypt had been a significant time of darkness, both physically and spiritually, for the Jewish nation. So when God brought them out of Egypt and into the desert, where when night fell, the darkness could have certainly overwhelmed them, God continued to show his people who he was by being their constant and visible source of light. So tell us, how did God lead his people during this time of uncertainty and darkness?
Well, in Exodus 13:21-22, it reads, "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people." So God didn't deliver his people and then depart from them. Every day of their wanderings, God's people walked in the light of his presence.
And in the desert, the harshness of the sun, the power and the heat of the sun, it could have harmed them. But God, he protected them with his presence in a pillar of cloud during the day, and then in the night when the darkness crept in and the darkness could have consumed them, God's fire was there with them. So his presence was with them in a pillar of fire, and it held the darkness at bay. And the desert obviously was barren. There was no source of food, no reliable or consistent source of food or water. And yet God's presence with them, he sustained them with bread from heaven and water from a rock. And so the light that illuminated every part of their journey through the wilderness was that life came from God.
And it's just another beautiful picture how God is present and engaged in the life of his people. So how did the people respond?
Well, sadly, over time, God's people forgot how his presence sustained them. They walked away from the light of his path and onto their own. And so this darkness disoriented them. They lost their sure footing, and they couldn't find peace, justice, or truth. Salvation was far from them, all because they turned their backs on God.
And so again, God's people find themselves in a hopeless and dark situation. And they would need a beacon of hope, a light that would illuminate their way back to the Father. So how did God provide for his people this time around?
Well, the prophet Isaiah in chapter 59, verses 15 and 16, it says, "The Lord looked, and he was displeased that there was no justice, and he saw there was no one, and he was appalled that there was no one to intervene. And so his own arm worked salvation for him, and his own righteousness sustained him." And so when there was nobody to intervene in Israel's desperate situation, God intervened, and he promised that he would be their rescue. He would be their deliverer. And a couple verses later, Isaiah 59:20, it says, "A redeemer will come to Zion for those who turn from their sins, says the Lord."
So God has just promised his people that a redeemer will come. So how does Isaiah describe this redeemer?
So in chapter 60, verses 1 to 3, he says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. And nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising." But Isaiah doesn't stop there. He goes on to describe in detail the new Jerusalem and the light that the coming Redeemer will bring to it. So in verses 19 and 20 it says, "The sun shall be no more your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give you light. But the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory. Your sun shall no more go down, nor your moon withdraw itself. For the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your days of mourning shall be ended."
And knowing their scriptures, the faithful people in Israel, they waited expectantly for this time that Isaiah had spoken of. And even when they were exiled, they watched and they waited. And then when a way was made for them to return, they returned with their eyes and ears open, and they posted a guard while they rebuilt this temple. And there were some among the people of Israel who also posted a watchman over their hearts. And you can read about this in the book of Nehemiah if you want to. But these generation passed, and there was this faithful remnant that still remained. And then finally, one day, this priest whose eyes and ears were open, he was on duty in the temple, and a messenger from God appeared, and the wait was over.
And so this priest you're talking about is Zechariah, and he was John the Baptist's father, and he prophesies about the coming Messiah. And we can read in Luke 1:78 and 79, it says, "Because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace." And this is the first glimpse of Jesus as light. In the Old Testament, God was the source of light for his people. And here in the New Testament, Jesus' declaration that he is the light once again would have left no doubt in his listeners' minds that he was claiming to be God. And so is there any significance to the fact that Jesus made this declaration while the Jewish nation at large was celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles?
Absolutely. The significance is lost on us, but for the Jews in Jesus' day, the message would have been loud and clear. When the Jews were celebrating the Feast of the Tabernacles, every evening except for the intervening Sabbath, 4 young priests would enter the court of the women. This wasn't a space that was specifically designated for the women, but the Jewish women could not pass beyond it. And it lay just beyond the court of the Gentiles, and on the other side of the beautiful gate. And in this court, there were 4 massive golden candlesticks, and they would have been about 75 feet tall, with golden bowls on top of them. So the 4 young men would climb ladders and fill these bowls with oil and light them. And because the temple sat on a hill above the rest of the city, the glow from these massive candlesticks would have illuminated every courtyard in Jerusalem. And every night, after they were lit, God's people would celebrate under their light. The Levitical orchestra would play while the people danced and sang praises to God. So all through the night, they were celebrating light in defiance of the darkness. So it was into this context that Jesus declared, "I am the light of the world." The true light had come.
And Jesus follows up this declaration with these words, "Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." And so do you see the consequence that Jesus relates to his announcement? The light has come. Will we follow? Something to reflect on as we close for today. See you tomorrow.
Bye.